Hello and welcome everybody back to Hawaii. This will be our last class that we're going to do over the internet, and after this I will see you next week on Tuesday. I think it was petitioned for me to start class a half hour late so that you guys can have more time on your clinical obligations, and I have to make some arrangements for that, but I have consented, so you will find that you'll be able to start class a half hour later starting next week on Wednesday. And all right, so let's get started on resetting the brain. There's a new term being floated around called a reset therapy. That's what we're going to talk about today. I don't find it to be a particularly well-defined term. I don't find it to be applied with a lot of I don't find it to be efficiently applied, meaning that it's at times will exclude some therapies that are not convinced that it should be excluded, or that it includes other therapies that may not be needed to be as holistically included. And so it's maybe just a little up in the air definition-wise or integration-wise to other therapies. There's not a lot of information out there on reset therapies, but when someone refers to reset therapy, I think they typically think about the psilocybin treatments in relationship to PTSD, which we will absolutely cover. And the way that they theorize that works is, I think, the springboard for what they might or are considering as other reset therapies. And my opinion on this might differ from other professionals or some of the researchers, and I'll try to disclose when I believe I'm speaking from an opinion position, as I always do. But anyways, let's talk about memory. This is actually a really important thing to talk about so we can get started. This is kind of the basis for what they are describing as a reset therapy. First of all, you have a memory event, and the memory becomes imprinted. And over time, that memory is eventually recalled, and that memory is then re-imprinted. And the next time that that's remembered, which is this third category here, you're not actually recalling the original imprinted memory. You are actually recalling the version that was re-imprinted the last time you remembered it. And that's actually really important to remember. This is true about memory. This isn't something that's so much believed to be a theory as much as it is just accepted science. And you can find it in your average cognitive psychology textbook. And it's been thought to be this way for a very long time. Well, by very long, I mean like maybe 10 or 15 years. And this is kind of the root reason for why they do police lineups the way that they do. Because if they simply give you a picture of the person and say, is this that person, the chances that you will re-imprint the missing or dissociated aspects of your memory onto the individual picture that you see, and then in future claim that is the person, even if you are faced with both the person from the picture and the actual abuser, you will stay with the person whose picture you saw rather than the actual abuser. That might be hard to follow or understand, but essentially you can re-imprint incorrectly, and that can cause a lot of problems. It's the reason why there's a lot of discussion and adjustments being made to the way that they do police lineups, or whether police lineups are ethical. And one thing we are absolutely sure on is that it is not ethical for a police officer to hand you a single picture and say, is this the person who did this to you? That doesn't work. It creates flaws in memories pretty quickly. And there's some pretty fabulous documentaries on that. If you would like to look that up, there's a lot of really significant stuff there. I'd also recommend that you watch either a documentary or a lecture by Mary Knight. Mary Knight used to live in Portland, and now I think she lives somewhere north, Washington. Mary Knight is an expert on memory, false memory, and memory recovery. I've spoken with her many times. She's incredible. I think she's probably the best person in the United States to talk to. But anyways, one more time with this, it's very important that you get this right. We have a memory event, which creates an imprinted memory. As time goes on, we remember that memory. But then after that memory is remembered, it actually re-imprints the memory. And when we remember again, We are remembering the last time we remembered it. That's what we're remembering. We're not actually remembering the original event anymore. Remembering the last time we remembered it. That's how memory works. Okay, so disrupting and trying to get the brain to reset some aspect of overarousal or hyperarousal, which is typical in the case of like PTSD. What we want to do is we want to catch it in that red box. We want to have an influence or effect on that middle box where we're remembering an old memory. Maybe it's the last time we remembered it, but then we want to greatly affect the process of re-imprinting. It doesn't mean that facts are changed. It just might mean that arousal is changed. And again, it's not obvious, depending on just one or two studies, that oh, we just meddled with it and we put it away and now it's put it away meddled with, so much as by meddling with it enough, it seems to trigger that memory to integrate into the whole cortex. So now I'm not reacting as though it's just happening. And again, we've kind of skipped over some of the neuroscience stuff because I think it would be a lot for you guys to handle in such a short class. I mean, a lot of information to integrate. But typically when we have a distressing memory, it's because when we think about the memory, a lot of the aspects of the fear and adrenaline and cortisol, a lot of those things are recreated in real time upon remembering it. And so it becomes a distressing memory, or we have flashbacks, or we have nightmares, or we have, anxiety or distress about it. And a lot of those are probably due to the fact that the nervous system has not integrated that memory very well. So the amygdala and the hippocampus and the thalamus are all very dysregulated when that memory is activated. And it's not really keeping the pace with the fact that the rest of the brain knows you're safe. And how do we get it to now keep pace with the rest of the brain? How do we get it to say, how do we get that memory to activate with the understanding that we're safe now and that it was in the past and that that person's not here anymore, or and that's over, or that some of those things are not true anymore? How do we get the rest of the brain to contribute to that experience, and it not to act in such a biased way, an out of context way, really? And something about intervening here in this memory recall and memory reimprinting stage has been proven to be very effective. And we'll talk about the treatments that seem to fit the model here. So we'll talk about EMDR interweaves, which a lot of people have said don't qualify. I graciously disagree, or courteously disagree, and I'll explain why. Hopefully you had a good explanation. You may not have covered that with Emily. That's kind of advanced EMDR. We'll cover that here. Bioacoustical utilization, which is interesting but problematic in some ways. Psilocybin, which you'll need to understand that because it's going to be something that they're going to talk about more and more and more every year. Alpha-theta neurofeedback, which is a growing trend within neurofeedback and has been a huge trend in addictions for a long time. And then I'll talk about my own little personal theory about sensory deprivation tanks, like the float-on tanks that you can see in Portland and things like that. I'll just give you a theory I have on that. So interweaves with EMDR. There's lots of debate on whether this is a reset therapy. EMDR would say, no, we're not a reset therapy, we're an integration therapy. I'm not convinced those are different. Cognitive resources used to create conflicting beliefs simultaneously. So, well, let me explain that real quick. So you're doing EMDR and you're asking them to focus on, say, an aspect of distress, like a sensation, a belief, a feeling, usually all those things, and all those things are coming up rapidly all at once. Sometimes people really do get stuck, and the bilateral stimulation and the intentional, focus on that sensation or stimulus just isn't causing the nervous system to integrate that memory or those experiences. And so you would do something called an interweave. And this is advanced. You don't even learn this like in your first year of doing EMDR. But it's where you would take a positive resource or a positive belief that definitely conflicts with the negative belief, but that a lot of your brain really does believe that it is 100% true. And you add that to their experience. So you might be asking them to think about a time where they were abused that was their first or worst memory. And then you might ask them to imagine that somebody who they think was a strong, loving protector was present, or what would happen if they were there. And it causes them to have to keep both trauma parts of their brain active, as well as something that conflicts with that. Something that says, I'm loved, I'm worthwhile, I'm safe, along with this happened to me. And if we can keep those both active at the same time, which is hard to do, but if you can, neurons that fire together wire together. And so it actually triggers integration. I've explained it in a very simple way. Please don't practice that without a couple years of training. It's very precise work. I looked very, very hard for a video that I could show you of this occurring, and there was nothing. I see this almost every day, if not every week, at my clinic in my personal practice, and I could not find a single video online of this occurring because it's just too personal to get consent to create a video on something like that. Which I wasn't super surprised, but I was also super sad. Thought maybe there'd be something out there I could use. All right. All right, this is designed to create a conflict with the original negative cognition, which triggers integration. Cognitive integration, is it a reset therapy? Definitions are inadequate. I'm not sure. So there's a lot more we could go in on that. I know this is probably good for discussion. Maybe we'll leave some room for you guys to ask questions about the video lectures when I get back. So if this is something you really want to talk more about, please make a note and then bring it up at that appropriate time. Bioacoustical utilization device. This is one of those funny things that doesn't have a lot of research. I decided I'd try it just because I understood the science of auditory evoked potentials and I understood the reset therapy. And this is a device claiming to have a reset effect. And the science or theory sounded really, really, really good. There's not a lot of science, not a lot of research, but the theory on it sounded really, really good. And I understood all the pieces to the theory really, really well. It's like, it should work. Let's give it a try. And it's pretty odd. It, in fact, is pretty fascinating. Hopefully they do, in fact, do more research. I'm going to let you watch a little video on this. Essentially, the theory is that it uses sound waves, specific kinds of sound waves that you'll find are not that pleasant to hear, that trigger specific parts of the brain to activate. So you have your auditory cortex, and if I have this frequency knob and I like rotate it, technically I'm moving what part of the auditory cortex I'm stimulating, because there's different parts of the auditory cortex for different maybe frequencies, even words and things like that, and activate different parts of the brain. And that evoked potential study, can go on and on and on and on forever. I'm sure we'll never get to the bottom of it. But in theory, if I asked you to focus on, say, a negative belief that's not true, or a negative sensation or negative memory, and then I rotate the frequency knob, at some point, I'm going to trigger a part of the auditory cortex or the cortex. I'm sure there's lots of parts that are affected, that is actually stimulating to the negative belief, the negative experience, the negative memory. And so I'm going to feel an enhancement of my anxiety towards that. And then at that point, you would add a disruption frequency, which I believe they have it do some sort of bilateral back and forth. So you have the frequency of the disruption signal, and I think the interval as well. So you'll muddle with those two, and that will actually essentially confuse or meddle with the re-imprinting process that we talked about here. That's the first example I'm going to let you see. So think about this for just a second before we watch the video. We're kind of in this middle stage here, and we're trying to change enough to get the cortex to integrate on a specific focused sensation, memory, belief. Okay? And we're going to choose a video of something more medical just to make it more dramatic. We're not going to choose something that could be easily affected. So let's see here.
By adjusting the frequency knob, it seems that Dave can enhance the tremor. Now by adjusting what...
So he has an essential tremor, which is genetic.
The disruptor knob, Dave can cancel out and minimize the tremor.
So I don't know if you can hear this, but he's meddling with the settings to make his tremor worse or better. We're going to go through this piece by piece so you can actually see it. Hopefully the audio gets picked up from the YouTube.
That's turned off again.
Okay.
So you just turned it off. You can see it getting worse.
Obviously, it didn't go away until I brought up the red knob.
I was amazed yesterday when I sat down, put the earphones on, the glass that I was giving an example of there. I hadn't had any experience with it at all, and I hit a place where the shaking just stopped. Dave Cameron. I've been a photographer and a videographer for the last 30 years. My father, my grandmother, my aunt, myself, my sister all have what is called essential tremor. And, it's starting to encroach on my photography abilities because I can't hold the camera still. I have to shoot at faster shutter speeds, or I use the tripod. And when I'm stressed or come in after a lot of work, my tremor gets worse. But I don't think it's ever not there. My dad would shake all the time as he aged. He would try to hide it by putting his hand in his pocket. If he had change in there, you'd hear the change rattling. Couldn't read paper because it would just shake. Mine's not quite there.
Dave used the BOD on 2 consecutive days, targeting his essential tremor.
So 2 consecutive days is the protocol for utilization of the BOD. Use it 10 minutes after finding the frequencies.
By adjusting the frequency knob,
2 days in a row.
it seems that Dave can enhance the
So he's enhancing the tremor, finding the right frequency to enhance it.
Now by adjusting what BOD Energetics is calling the disruptor knob,
Now he's adding the bilateral
Dave can
disruption
cancel out
frequency.
and minimize the
He's
tremor.
adding another evoked potential to kind of disrupt the tremor process, or disrupt what he activated. Now it has to be optimized. So you're fiddling with it until you find what gets you the results you want. Looks like he's got it. So at that point, he would hold it for 10 minutes. I'm not going to go any further. They roll through it a few different times, so let you watch what he does the next day as well. I believe the simple study that they published showed on tremors that if they used it 10 minutes after finding the right frequencies, and they did it for 2 consecutive days, there was an 80% reduction in tremors following those 2 sessions. And again, I'm sure that a lot more research is needed on this device, but I find it to be pretty fascinating. I have used it for a couple of years in my practice. It's not my favorite treatment, but it is one of my most effectives. most effective treatments. And that's a complicated thing to say. You're like, well, why wouldn't you use the most effective treatment that you have? And it's interesting. It's a fairly loud and odd experience. It's very new. There's not a lot of research, and so I mean, I'm not gonna. I probably do offer it to a lot of patients, and people are more likely to try it once or twice. But people don't usually use it on more than 2 symptoms. They use it on some of the biggest things that they have going on in their life. Then they tend to kind of shirk away from it a little bit. And I think part of it is that it is very loud and it is very screeching. I don't know if you could hear it in the video, and that's why I was repeating what was occurring. But people just don't tend to return to it. It doesn't have some sort of cathartic ending the way that EMDR really does. People have a very strong amount of catharsis upon accomplishing something in EMDR. It's hard work. It feels like they've earned it. There's just something missing with the bod, and I can't really speak much to that other than that that people tend to shy away from it. Despite the fact that I've had, overwhelmingly positive reports at it doing what we sought out for it to do. Anyways, so there's some thoughts. All right, so let's talk about maybe the big one, psilocybin. And the reason why this is the big one is because it's what you're going to hear a lot about. I want you to move through, your academics and your clinical practice as professionally as possible. And this is one of those things that you need to know a little bit about and to be able to discuss it so that you can network in the community effectively. So from what I understand, psilocybin is at least derived from a natural hallucinogen, specifically mushrooms. And the studies are typically done in low doses during intentional recall of traumatic events to disrupt memory imprinting process. The specific pros are that it's very likely to have efficacy. The research looks good. Essentially, it showed a reduction of post-traumatic stress symptoms. And when they did a follow-up of about 1 or 2 years, those studies showed that the results improved following 1 to 2 years. So they got even better on the follow-up, which is very hopeful. I'm assuming and very hopeful that this would be an affordable therapy, partially because I don't know that there's going to be an easy way to patent something that's naturally derived. And so if it's not patented, in theory, if they can get some sort of potency control, which we're only now just getting good at, and some of you naturopath students probably know a lot more about that than me. The potency variable, if that can be adequately resolved, then it's likely to be inexpensive, and that would be awesome. Cons, the subjects consistently requested higher doses, and the lower doses were actually more effective in research, so that there's a desire for more. The best results were actually at a dose where the patients did not experience any form of a high that they could speak to. But all of those individuals requested a higher dose, and individuals that were at higher doses where it was impairing even wanted higher doses. And so that's not likely to play out extremely well or is extremely hopeful in the case of, say, like legalization, which several states have. So, I mean, you can just think about that, the politics of it and the mental health implications of it. We also don't know much about long-term use or high-dose use. I'm sure some people would claim that, but ultimately, no, we really, really don't. We don't see how it interacts with medication. We don't see, how it plays out over 10, 20 years. We just don't know those things at all. So there's a lot of unknowns there. Obviously, there's some very fascinating and hopeful results used clinically, especially if done in a controlled way to get the maximum results. All right. So there's a few studies down there that you are welcome to go through and look at. I gave you some meta-analysis, and that one can lead you to a whole bunch of research, so you can kind of see where I got some of that information. And then some current studies in progress. This website will actually tell you all the studies that are being done right now. So you can kind of see them as they're coming out, and that can be really cool. So you can stay on top of it if you'd like to. Alpha-theta neurofeedback. So at this point, I'm sure you guys are dying to learn about neurofeedback. We haven't covered it yet. It's one of the last things we're going to cover. So we're just going to give you some basics on this. That this is using biofeedback on brainwaves. And with this specific therapy, we're actually enhancing something called theta, which is essentially a brainwave that is stimulated by psilocybin, from what I understand. And quite possibly a lot of other reset therapies, likely a lot of them also see that same stimulation of that same frequency. Theta, which is thought to be associated with unconscious learned behavior, creativity, and sleepiness. It can have a whole lot of what we call abreactions, which is when someone's responding to a negative event in the past without knowing what their reaction is actually correlated to or connected to. So it's like having a flashback but not knowing what the flashback is. Or it's like having an anxiety attack but not knowing what the anxiety is about. Or it's, in alpha-theta's case, far more likely to just be odd somatic symptoms, like my shoulders feel funny, my shoulders tingling, I feel really cold, I feel really warm, just odd physiological sensations. So the patient relaxes in a zero-gravity chair, usually eyes closed training. There's some eyes open protocol. I just don't tend to gravitate towards them personally. I don't find them to be as effective. The room is often monitored but not accompanied by a therapist, and that's something that's kind of new. I've been doing it for like 6 years, so I've been a little ahead of the game. But it's a hypnogenic therapy. I don't particularly find being in the room for that ideal. I think that a lot of the abreactions might be due to the fact that they feel like they're being watched while they're at a very, very near sleep state. The patient achieves a rare mental state where the SMR is idle, or the sensory mode rhythm. So technically their body is kind of in that sleep paralyzed state, but they're still conscious. They're essentially somewhere between sleep and awake. Parts of their brain are asleep that are typically not asleep when they're awake, and parts of their brain are awake that are typically not awake when they're asleep. And you can actually see that and chart that on their electroencephalograph chart. It's kind of easy to see it if you know what you're doing. And so you can go like, oh, they did really well this session. It's a little bit, it's not usually like that in some types of neurofeedback, but in this case, it's a little easier to see how they did. Anyways, so much like the psilocybin, essentially it's believed to either interrupt processing, or in my theory, I think it actually allows some of the unconscious process material to come out and play, to come out and process in a safe environment. The alpha and the alpha-theta is a part of the neurofeedback that keeps you calm. So it's kind of like saying to all of the unconscious garbage and junk that we have piled away in our unconscious, it's like saying, okay, you can come on out as long as the body stays calm. So we're just going to say, alpha, keep the body calm. Theta, bring it on. And so a lot of the abreactions that are experienced in alpha theta are usually experienced as very strange or odd or weird. Weird is probably the most common word I hear from 80% of my cases that get treated. Weird. Framing that for the patient is really important. If I can tell them that weird means you're doing it right, weird means you're doing it well, weird means you're getting better. A lot of times there's no distress associated with the weirdness at all. They just go, well, I'm doing it right, you know. Or if they have this cognitive realization while they're in alpha theta that I'm not sure I could move if I thought I'm not sure I could move if I wanted to. That sleep paralysis, which is the reason why we don't sleepwalk every night. If you tell them, well, if you notice that sensation, that simply means that you're doing it, you're doing a great job, you're where you're supposed to be. And if you tell them that, they're not usually distressed by it. So there's a number of really, really, really critical things that they have to be coached on. If you don't do it absolutely right, or if you miss something, you can have a patient who gets really, really worked up. And so a lot of coaching before someone starts alpha theta, a lot of psychoeducation, and a lot of really important containment, meaning that we've talked about this from the very first session. They have to really buy into the fact that you know what you're doing and that you can handle whatever comes up. And if they don't feel that sense of safety in the room, then that's going to have a significant problem. You're going to have more negative reactions. One extreme example would be that researchers took alpha-theta to Afghanistan and decided to do alpha-theta on soldiers who were still deployed while they were deployed. And the amount of reactions that they experienced was unbelievable. And I suspect that we'd have the same problems with things like psilocybin, that you don't want to get someone processing while they're still in danger. The same would apply for doing some alpha-theta on somebody who's still living with their abuser. And so you don't actively offer some of these therapies to patients who are actively unsafe or actively being abused. You are not going to see integration. You are going to see a lot of stuff that you might not be equipped to, or very likely aren't equipped to handle. So there's a triage when it comes to trauma therapy, and we talked about that a few weeks ago. But scene safety. Make sure that your patient is actively safe in their real life. That processing trauma, from a systematic standpoint, isn't to be done until a lot of the things that they're thinking and feeling are not true anymore. All right, so deep relaxation states are maintained while training up the theta frequency, used for addictions, unconscious learned behavior, and PTSD. Addictions have been using it a lot longer than everybody else. I started using it on PTSD quite a bit before my peers started to, and that gave me the ability to kind of speak up and down the West Coast a couple times a year on the topic. So I've really enjoyed being able to be an educator on alpha-theta neurofeedback. It's been a blast, specifically related to trauma dissociation, trauma and dissociation. So a lot of Ivory Gardens conferences and things like that. I think we're going to go down to California in November and speak at a clinical summit. We'll see. Considered extremely risky by neurofeedback clinicians and researchers. I've never had any of those issues, but I think that we've got some advanced protocols when it comes to how we coach our clients. But just know that the community will consider you pretty ethically gray if any of you tried to do this within a short period of time without a lot of training and without prepping your clients a lot. So yes, there are a lot of significant reactions in research. Significant training and supervision is required to use this therapy. So there you have it. We'll learn more about neurofeedback in the coming 2 weeks. So sensory deprivation tanks. This one's an interesting one. This one's my theory, okay? This one's purely 100% just my own little interesting thing that I think would be fun to research. There's things out in like Portland, like float-on tanks and things like that, where you kind of climb into a little chamber in a quiet room, a little soundproof chamber, and you're floating in a very strong Epsom salt bath. So you're just floating on top of the water. It's completely dark. The pH, I think, is, I'm trying to figure out what it is, but I think it's supposed to be the lowest stimulating environment that we can generate functionally. And it's thought to be, very healing mentally and cathartically, and the whole experience is supposed to be therapeutic. And it's typically done through like a spa type thing. But people are finding that there seems to be some unconscious benefit here that's hard to quantify. When I have people who go to these float-on tanks, sometimes they have experiences that are a lot like alpha-theta. And there's even some that are recorded, like I think Jennifer Lawrence has gone on record explaining her experience, which sounded like an abreaction. Maybe there's some traumatic stuff that her mind was wanting to process, and she didn't have proper framing or containment from somebody who didn't know how to coach her through that process. And again, these are spas, they're not therapy offices. So that's not too surprising. But think about this for a second. We've talked about the alpha-theta and how the sensory motor strip goes idle, and perhaps the parietal lobe is more activated, and there's a couple things like that occur. It's sort of like sleep, it's sort of not like sleep. I would bet, and I'm willing to do the research on this in the near future, but I'm willing to bet that, or wondering, speculating, if that with a low enough level of stimulation, the sensory motor rhythm or the sensory motor strip that goes idle in alpha-theta also goes idle just from lack of stimulation. There's not enough evoked potential to keep it active. And so the individual's sensory motor rhythm goes idle, and they might approach something similar or identical to alpha-theta, which is, and again, there's just enough whispers from my clients and other clients and different people's accounts to suggest that maybe there's some similarity between the two. It would be really great to hook somebody up to a big detailed brain map and send them in there and find out, which is something that I'll have the ability to do in the very near future. So yeah, a ton of research is needed. You know, you can ask me in a few years. I'll probably have a decent personal opinion formed on it in probably less than a year, as I'll have the equipment to do research level brain mapping, and I have the contacts at the Photon clinics that already want to do the same thing. So it's just a matter of sitting down and doing it in a way that we, you know, could publish it, which would be ideal. All right, so I thought, well, let's talk about spirituality and the reset effect. This one's a complicated one. We haven't really spent much time talking about spirituality, and I usually do talk a lot more about it. So we're going to take some time today and cover some of the things we haven't yet covered in other classes. So this is specifically applies to the reset therapy or reset effect, but we can think of it also more broadly as its own lecture. Okay, hold on a second. Well, we're missing some apparent information here, but I think we'll do okay. Let's just look at some of the research here. Okay, and you guys can look some of this stuff up on your own time. I only found a few studies for you. There's unbelievable amounts of stuff out there on spirituality and mental health. I was going to do my own PhD in you know, spiritual integrations and mental health, and was told don't do that. It's crazy out there. You don't want to do research on that. You'll never be able to do a literacy review to save your life. There's too much stuff. So in the last 10, 15 years, it's become extremely popular to do research on these topics. And there's a handful of individuals out there that just pump out research pretty fast. But maybe some important things to remember or think about in this is that in the different research studies where they've taken, you know, hundreds of college students and they charted them across a number of years, and then, you know, looked at, say, anxiety for this first study here, you know, showed that individuals who became spiritual throughout their college experience had a substantial marked anxiety. You know, there's a number of other issues where it talks about spirituality and people's ability to engage in coping skills. Or this third study down here actually makes an argument that there must be something more than just coping and spirituality, that the results are more ingrained in us. And we could stop and think about that for a second. You know, that article research study kind of makes the argument that we wouldn't call it coping any more than we'd call hygiene coping. That taking care of yourself as a spirit, or taking care of yourself as a spiritual being, has so much influence on our well-being that we wouldn't call it coping any more than we would call hygiene coping. That's just about taking care of ourselves. And the more you dive into research on spirituality and mental health, the more you'll find that, like, wow, we really don't want to do addictions research without talking about a higher power, because, ooh, the results get pretty bad. You know, it's too big of a loss to let go of it. And you have to spend a decent amount of time trying to think about what does that mean and why is that way. The spirituality is like this strange thing that you would have a tendency, maybe culturally, our culture would have this tendency to say that it's this kind of crutch, maybe, that we use to kind of get through life, or to try to give us a sense of purpose and meaning. There's just one little problem. I'm willing to be challenged on this, and I actually want to be challenged on this. to help refine my thinking. But typically, delusions don't cause people to be more oriented towards their relationships and their responsibilities. So disorientation, which is maybe the fixation on something false or not true or not depicting reality or not relating to reality, should not have a very, very strong correlation with increased responsibility, increased healing, increased relationships. Basically, that they are showing that they are becoming more oriented as they engage in spirituality, rather than less oriented, which is what you would say for something that was maybe a delusion. So delusions are disorienting. Engagement in spirituality is orienting. That's odd, isn't it? Like that's a little problematic. You know, if we can sit back and say I don't believe in spirituality, and there's that problem in research is actually so strong that that researchers who don't believe in spirituality have actually had to come up with some very interesting arguments to suggest that maybe maybe they represent something real, but not literally, maybe more archetypally. But to say that it doesn't represent reality at all, there's not evidence for that in terms of how it orients rather than disorients us. So anyways, we'll talk more about that in a minute. So anyways, there's one more. The NBCI published study here. The link there that you can click on and get access to. The healthcare workers can't afford not to include spirituality in their work. It's a big, maybe almost looks like a meta-analysis, even though it doesn't use that word. But a whole bunch of studies combined to show that specifically social workers just cannot afford to drop spirituality from their social practice. It's just too big of a loss to let go. So let's talk about the reset effect. We see people possibly reconstructing their personalities. That there's a study that I was trying to find and I just couldn't find it for you, so I apologize. But showing that when there's spiritual conversion in Alcoholics Anonymous, the recovery rate for those individuals is I believe it was 80%. Again, I feel bad saying that without quoting it directly. But that's unbelievable. I mean, there isn't anything in research to show the same benefits as people who experience a strong conversion, a spiritual conversion. We don't have anything in science that produces those kinds of effects. That's a big deal. That's maybe a problem or interesting, or depending on how you view it. We don't know what to do with that yet. So they can, to some degree, restructure themselves so much so that they can corner an addiction in a way that we don't know how to recreate. We've got some really, really cool hope with alpha-theta. We've got some really, really cool hope with some upcoming interventions. But nothing that kind of rivals an individual spontaneously, and that's what the research shows. There's no predicting factors. Spontaneously engaging with themselves as a spiritual being. So rapid and effective reconstruction of their habits, their behaviors, their support system, and their routine that they change. And that might be a big part of how they can stay sober. That might be a large ingredient to it, maybe moderate to huge. But they can essentially replace everything. I mean, it's very hard to say, well, I'm going to change out this friend group, or I'm going to change out this program I'm involved in. But when people join different religious institutions, they kind of have the ability to kind of shed a lot of what they were and who they were, and start over with different patterns, different routines. And there's not a lot of familiar stimulus to re-trigger who they were, which allows them to rapidly starve a lot of the old patterns and behaviors in their life that they are wishing to prune. There's not a lot of, there's a reason why there's AA groups and things like that meet every day. And I think those things are good. It gives you the ability to try to starve something out of your life, replacing everything else, which you need, because the alternative might be death. You know, some people are opposed to, you know, those kinds of rapid transformations. It's like, well, when the alternative is death, you know, feels different. So there's a lot of changes in purpose and meaning, and there's research on that. I believe I had one of those articles or one of those research papers I posted, that relate to purpose and meaning changes. There's just a lot of research out there. You know, you can do a Google search and get a dozen easily. And then there is something there that I'm not articulate on yet. There's something about purpose and meaning, very Jungian theory about having purpose and having meaning that definitely affects our ability to engage in the world effectively and to engage with our relationships effectively. So let's talk about body, mind, and spirit connection. The book that you're reading by Bessel van der Kolk talks about how integrated the body and the mind are, and how if you're a therapist, you kind of move through your clinical practice, you know, looking through everything through the lens of the mind. And we're kind of sometimes disconnected by how much the body is affected. You know, it's like, oh, you've got an autoimmune condition. Okay, well, you should see your doctor about that. It's like, okay, yes. But just like the body keeps the score details, they're far more integrated. In fact, they're totally integrated in a way that we weren't really thinking about or considering. It was a dimension shift that we weren't really taking our time to appreciate and understand how our scope really does reach through and connects in a deeply integrated way to their disability or to their autoimmune issues or to their migraines, etc. And that we do have scope on some of those things in the way that the mind is fully integrated into that experience. And there's no part of you that isn't your body, and there's no part of you that isn't your mind. That's a complicated thing to think about. But in the same way, I would propose, just a proposal, and you can make your own philosophy on this, but the spirit connection is the same. There's no part of you that isn't a spirit, and there's no part of you that isn't a body or a mind. And you know, we'll talk more about this, and I'd like to find more research. I just apologize, you know, not having you know, great internet access and things like that. But we could look at some of the research on, well, I did post some, but some of the research on addictions and see how much more improvement there is when we add a single element like the spirit or spiritual awareness. That it's like saying, well, now we know about hygiene. It's like, okay, it's not coping, it's something more integrated, something more significant. And it'll feel like common sense when it started to be practiced. But just like the body keeps the score, makes you see things you didn't see, it makes you appreciate things you didn't see, and it makes them feel like common sense in a very short period of time, I would propose that integrating spiritual work into your practice can feel no different as significant and easily integrated. And how to do that is harder, and obviously there's a lot of controversy to it, less controversial than talking about how you integrate the body and mind. But let's just keep it simple at this moment. Let's keep it simple and say that acknowledging that you are a spirit, acknowledging that you are a spiritual being, maybe is a better way of putting it, allows you to contend with that part of yourself more easily. And there's a whole host of things that come along with that you could break down, like with considering the body, or like a doctor considering the mind. But it's like asking us to think about things existentially, about the future, about our death, about our purpose, about our meaning, about leaving a legacy, about being a part of something bigger than ourselves, like getting inside of our own immediate desires. And there's a lot of ingredients that come with thinking about yourself as a spiritual being that I think are just harder to reach for from the framework of the mind, or harder to reach for from the framework of the body. That's my opinion on it. The cost of not integrating the spirit is as high as leaving out not including the body or not including the mind. And I think that's true. I really do. So this is more of a discussion question, which we obviously can't discuss in this area, but a lot of people wonder about the compatibility of the science and the spirituality. I don't think that there is incompatibilities. I think that we're just really bad at science sometimes, and I think that we're really bad at spirituality sometimes. And I think that they are actually compatible. That if we were good enough at both, we could see them integrate. But we're not. And so we leave them quite separate and unintegrated. And there's nothing we can do about that. And I think that you know, those of you, you know, within your program of NUNM, you probably can appreciate that, as you can see, you know, how Western medicine has struggled in a number of areas, and you believe you have some training that's been poorly integrated into another system. And you can see how there's poor integrations, and the cost of that poor integration can be really high. And so I think of it very similar in that way, where they could be integrated in theory, but we shouldn't hold our breath. All right, so that's all I've got. You guys are welcome to email me at joshua.centerpoint@gmail.com. You probably are also welcome to call me, you know, on August 17th when I get home. I have that phone number listed on the syllabus in case you guys want to get some office hours or have questions. And then I'll make sure that I leave some time for you to ask questions about the various videos that I recorded that you can watch or that you are going to watch, and write down your questions, bring them to me at that time. And yeah, hopefully you guys are having a good time, and I'll see you next week.